What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. It's Tags here once again, filling the host chair while Bobby continues his vacation. Hopefully you guys got to see that video I posted about the Arizona Diamondbacks with him and his dad. It was such a cool moment, but check that out if you haven't. Today, we are going to be talking about players with sneaky upside, as well as players that our guest is higher on than the current expert consensus. And this is kind of important because our guest today is kind of a big deal. I mean, he's finished as the #1 analyst in our yearly ranking competition 3 separate times. No one else in the world can say that they've accomplished that. No one, okay? So I'm talking about the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Sean Koerner of the Action Network. Sean, thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We were just saying, this is the last week where we don't have an NFL game this year, so the storm is a-coming.
It is. I'm excited for things to start happening. Unfortunately, we got some news that kind of dropped, over the last 48 hours that we're going to discuss just shortly before we get into the meat of the show. But before we do get into a little bit of that news, I do feel the need to talk about our draft simulator. I mean, I had dinner with my brother-in-law the other night, and he started talking to me about the hassle of mock drafts and how long they take with people leaving the room, people drafting multiple quarterbacks in the first 4 rounds just to do it to mess with people. He was sick of it. And I was like, wait a minute, he doesn't understand our draft simulator? I was like, so since he doesn't know, I'm sure some of you don't know. Our draft wizard legitimately allows you to draft against ADP, experts, a mixture of everything in a matter of minutes. And no, it's not the same every time. Literally, it randomizes who the AI is actually going to draft against you, which is really neat because obviously every draft is different. If you don't believe me, head to fantasypros.com/simulator and test my theory. It's free, so you have no excuse. Stop wasting time in other mock draft lobbies. If you want access to premium features in there, we have a special offer right now that our listeners can take advantage of. Sign up for Yahoo DFS, deposit $10 that you get to play with, and we will give you a free 6-month pass to our Hall of Fame package. It's our top tier. It's a $65 value. To take advantage of that offer, just go to fantasypros.com/offers. Now, Sean, really quick on the news items. We have Sterling Shepard, who broke a finger. He's expected to miss a month, but could be back by the season opener. Meanwhile, another Giants wide receiver is out for the year. That's Corey Coleman, who suffered a torn ACL, leaving the Giants to go out into the free agent market. Apparently, they're going to bring in Kelvin Benjamin for a workout. Sean, who are you bumping the most with these injuries? And is Kelvin Benjamin someone that can be fantasy relevant again?
To be honest, this is all kind of unfazing me. We're still far enough out where a guy can fracture his finger and still be ready for week 1. So I'm going to take a little time before I, start docking Shepard for missed games. But I'm not really, looking to invest too much in their passing game. And, Kelvin Benjamin, I dropped in our Dynasty League. So I'm hoping he doesn't become relevant this year. But, they're just not an offense. They just have too many guys that run routes, the same part of the field. So it's just not a team I'm investing in. And then, later in the season, I'm anticipating Daniel Jones to take over. So, all these guys, I think their stock is going to drop, especially when we hit the fantasy playoff season. So, despite all the shakeup, I love having shakeups because I get to update my projections, but this isn't really having much impact on them yet.
That's exactly how I felt. That's why I didn't want to spend too much time on it. If anything, Golden Tate might receive a slight bump in targets if Sterling Shepard had to miss any time. But again, I do expect Shepard to be back for the season. Corey Coleman was going to start, but at the same time, how many targets could we really project him for as the number 3 receiver? The other bit of news is that Jerick McKinnon had a flare-up on his surgically repaired knee, and it's landed him on the PUP list, which is awful when you're looking at a timeshare to begin with. Am I right, Sean? I mean, this can't be good for Jerick McKinnon.
Absolutely not. And, I'll get to it later, but, I think Tevin Coleman might be overlooked. On paper, this backfield is definitely a logjam, but no guarantee all these guys are going to be active every week. So I think this is just good news for Tevin Coleman. McKinnon wasn't really a guy I was targeting. If anything, Breida later in the draft, in these kind of 3-back scenarios, we saw a guy like Philip Lindsay, how that could work out if you strike gold there. But I'm thinking McKinnon news obviously hurts him, but I think it's beneficial to Coleman. So we could talk about that later.
Absolutely. And that's this is just more for me from McKinnon. I felt like he was someone that could be in line for maybe 70 targets, kind of like a Theo Riddick type role, and offers some fantasy relevance in PPR formats. But obviously with that crowded backfield, this is definitely a killer to his stock right now. So, Sean, let's take a look at these rankings of yours and talk about some players that you're higher on than the industry, as well as some players that you're lower on. And to do that, we're going to be using our expert consensus rankings, or ECR, as I'll refer to it. To find this on the site, just go to the NFL homepage and click on expert consensus rankings. Let's start at the running back position. But before I ask you for the players, and, talk about those guys, how do your rankings in the preseason differ from how you draft your fantasy team? Because projections can be one thing, but weekly upside can be another.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was going to mention that. I'm basing these rankings off of my projections. I spend so much time and effort, and that's my specialty is the projections. But I'm making median projections, so I really think about them in sort of a 3D sense. And there's going to be so much volatility in season, so I try not to just stick with my rankings. I think it also depends what part of the draft you're in and the position itself. So you mentioned the mock draft simulator. That's a great way to prepare for draft, because you kind of realize where you can kind of wait at a position, where you need to go earlier. So I'm planning out my overall draft plan beforehand, but I'm willing to take guys if they fall to me. So my rankings, I like to compare them to the ADP and just kind of see where I might get guys later. But I don't treat them as religiously as people think. So, when it comes to like backup running backs, I love to stash them. So, I might have a running back ranked 80th, but I really think he has, RB2 upside in season. So he's a guy I'll actually target later in the draft. So I just think, when I do my position tier articles, I go more in depth with, sort of how you should view my projections and rankings.
That's exactly what I do. I tell people in tiers, because the idea is that you just want to get inside that tier, whether it's the first guy or the last guy. You don't have to feel torn. You don't have to feel bad about picking one of those guys, but it kind of helps you, enter the draft and not let emotion take over and saying, this is my tier. I made this tier list before the draft came, and it makes you feel better about it. And, it does depend. I tried to talk about this during a YouTube live stream that I did. I was doing a mock draft and I talked through it, basically saying I drafted a couple safe players in the beginning, the first 3 or 4 rounds, and I felt like my team was lacking upside. And there's certain points like that in a draft, you have to be honest about your team and say, I feel like I'm missing those league potential week winners. I need to take some upside, maybe some guys that are a little bit more boom or bust. So that's why I wanted to ask you about that question. One player at the running back position that you are higher on than the consensus, and I'm actually even higher than you, so I'm right here in lockstep with you about James White. And I am so tired of hearing people tell me that Patriots running backs are inconsistent and you can't trust them. James White was he was a top 5 consistent running back. He finished number 7 overall at the running back position, but he was actually top 5 in terms of his actual consistency in the lineup. With Rob Gronkowski gone, this is fantastic. James White, you have him 4 spots higher than the ECR. Why do you like James White so much?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And, he's a guy that during the season, I don't envision ranking him below 27 that often. He's such a high floor player. So he's going to be a consistent RB2, especially in any type of PPR. So we're talking about half PPR. He's going to be pretty valuable there. But he does have spiked weeks if, Sony Michel's out or Damian Harris struggles for some reason. He has low end RB1 upside. So he's the perfect blend of high floor with a pretty high ceiling. But I think that's why people kind of shy away from him. His ceiling isn't, RB1 overall. And I think too many people just try to hit home runs when, especially the low 20s in his ADP. I think he's a steal because you know exactly what you're going to get. And that's valuable for something. And like you mentioned, if you're drafting a team where you're taking a bunch of high upside guys, it makes sense to add a guy like White who's really high floor.
Yeah, and I feel the exact same way about it. And you're right, he doesn't have the upside to finish as the RB1, but we did see, last year we saw his ceiling, arguably. I think that we could probably admit that that's probably close to his ceiling as RB7, and that's obviously what you're looking for when you're drafting a player in that 25 to 30 range. Like if you have a guy that could potentially finish as a low-end RB1, that's as much equity as you could hope for at the running back position. I think people are overlooking this with Gronk out. Like last year was the first year we saw Gronk kind of like fade away. Like even when he was on the field, he wasn't very good. I think it's no coincidence that James White saw 7.7 targets per game when his previous career high was 5.4 targets per game. That's going to continue with Gronk gone. Don't think N'Keal Harry is going to steal those targets. I love the call on James White. Now, oddly enough, Sean, the guy that you're lower on, much lower on than the consensus, 7 spots as a matter of fact, is Sony Michel. Sony Michel you have down as your RB28. Is this based on his knee injury that you're concerned about? Because he had another knee scope this offseason. Is it Damian Harris? What's the issue with Sony Michel right now?
Yeah, it's sort of all of the above. His knee issue is definitely a long-term concern. I actually have him missing a couple games. I think it's fair to assume that. But I do think that when he does, he's going to have those games where they just run him in the ground. So I've actually been getting him in best ball. I think he's more valuable in formats like that where you can just take his big weeks. But, for season long, those missed games, especially when you spend, RB2 value or draft capital on him, I think it's a bit rich. And he's a guy that his points per game value will still be high. But with Damian Harris behind him, I'm a little bit more concerned about that as well. He could outright overtake that role. So, Michel's not even guaranteed the role we saw last year. And, he had fumbling issues in college, and we know Bill Belichick is the guy that you cannot fumble. So he has that risk too. There's just way too many risk factors. And it's important to note that these rankings, they're based off of total season output. So a guy where you're projecting, a little bit above average missed time, I guess that's the way you'd say it, it's going to impact their overall end of season rank. But I do think he does hold some value if you're able to, afford a few missed starts from him.
Yeah, this is like one of those guys that comes into play where it's like projections can be one thing, but the way that you draft would be another. Sony Michel, I feel like if he's healthy and he's playing, I don't think I can rank him outside the top 24 on a weekly basis. The issue with me, Sean, is like I saw what happened in the playoffs, and we have to remember that Sony Michel missed all of training camp last year. And I know running backs can kind of walk into a different scenario, but he was a rookie. He missed training camp. He was eased into the lineup, and when it mattered most, the Patriots were like, "Hey, give this kid the rock," and he ran with that job. Like 336 yards and 6 touchdowns through 3 games in the playoffs. I don't think you could ask more of a running back. So does it worry you at all that you might have him too low if he does stay healthy?
No, I think that's a great point. And that's why I am targeting him best ball, because he is dropping a little bit too much. I think with Michel, what weeks he's going to go off. And I think that alone is valuable. This again, these are half PPR. So I think any sort of PPR, especially if you're, using projections, he's going to be just a tad lower. So that's part of it too. But yeah, if you're in a standard format, the way I handle running backs, I still think you should target Michel, just because you're going to get, several high upside weeks. He's still going to have weeks where he gets 20 plus touches and, multi-touchdown upside. I'm
going to give you a scenario here. I just want to ask you who you would draft. So if you're in a draft and let's pretend that your roster, it's going as you kind of planned it. Would you draft someone like Sony Michel, or would you draft someone like David Montgomery?
I feel like Montgomery, his upside, we all know his upside, and his ADP is sort of factoring all that in. I think the way I handle, my teams, it would probably be Sony Michel. Like I said, I think it's valuable knowing when a guy's going to go off. With David Montgomery, who knows how it's going to really shape up with Tariq Cohen and Mike Davis there. So I think, he could have the upside, but he's going to be inconsistent week to week. Whereas, that's obviously the case with Michel. We'll just have a better idea of when Michel's going to go off. So I think just my ability to kind of load up at running back, I'd rather have a guy like Michel.
I would lean on that side as well, because I feel like if he's healthy, we know that he's going to get the rock. Damian Harris, used a first rounder on Sony. He lived up to the hype in the playoffs. Damian Harris, while I like Damian Harris as a player, I really do. I think he's one of the better, guys to have on your bench in case something does happen to Sony. Montgomery, I am a little concerned about that backfield. I think that Mike Davis might have a bigger role than we were all anticipating. And fortunately, we're going to find all this stuff out soon, but hopefully before draft season rolls around. One real quick question before we move on to the wide receiver position. How are you handling someone like Melvin Gordon right now? We've talked about the fact that he's holding out. He's looking for a new deal, and he said he wants to be traded, or, he wants a new contract. He wants an extension. Are you willing to draft him at the end of the first round? What's the breaking point for you where you feel like the risk is worth the reward?
No, I'm passing on right now. I really do. I'm pretty wimpy when it comes to the first few rounds. I try to not just make a losing pick. I just don't think he's falling enough to where it's worth the risk. And it's hard. It's such a subjective thing to kind of predict. So I actually threw up a poll yesterday, sort of the wisdom of the crowds, where I had, close to 3,000 people vote. And about half the people think his holdout will extend into the season. And some sports books had odds on him holding out through the season. I think it was only like 40%, but still, that's way too high of a risk. And, we saw Le'Veon Bell last year. It's just a disaster. So I think, especially with someone like me, I'm very confident with my ability to manage my team in season. I really don't want to risk it with a gamble early on. I'm more risk averse than the first couple rounds. But, when it comes later in the draft, I'm being much more aggressive with Austin Eckler and Justin Jackson.
That's absolutely fair. And so would it be fair to say that you feel the same way about Todd Gurley?
Yeah, I think that, we were probably overblowing it back in May and June. I'd probably be less scared of taking him. And, we saw Darrell Henderson's ADP jump way up. So that kind of killed the sneaky upside there. But, just the bottom of the RB1 tier is such a disaster right now that I've sort of shifted my draft strategy to kind of avoid that. Like I said when you were on our pod earlier this week, I just load up on wide receivers early on because I'm confident in some of these mid-round running backs and my ability to kind of stash high upside backs for in-season. So I'm basically just staying away from the end of this RB1 tier.
That's absolutely fair. And now before we move on to the wide receiver position, a word from our sponsor, Pristine Auction. I always browse on there for deals, and even though I'm not a Tyler Boyd guy, I saw his signed jersey, like autographed jersey, go for just $22 the other day. I even saw a pylon, an actual pylon from the end zone signed by Isaiah Crowell. The fact that they have that just highlights how diverse this selection is. They have daily auctions ending nightly with hundreds of lots. Tons of stuff for the man cave. There's something for a fan of every single team. They guarantee authenticity, and all items come with authentication from only the most trusted sources. And best of all, it's affordable. Most people don't think they can afford this stuff, but it's much more affordable than you'd think, as mentioned with that Tyler Boyd jersey. It is PRISTINE auction.com. Quick and free to register, but make sure you enter FantasyPros, all one word, in the registration code field located at the top of the registration page. It will give you a free $5 credit. Again, that's pristineauction.com with promo code FantasyPros. Now, let's move on to the wide receiver position. We're going to talk about 4 players here. 2 that you like more than the consensus, 2 that you like less. Okay, James Washington, I get this one, but I'm going to let you explain this. You are 17 spots higher on James Washington than the current consensus is. Do you think that he earns that starting job alongside Juju Smith-Schuster?
Yes, and I guess even if he doesn't, there's such a big void left by Antonio Brown that, even if Moncrief does inherit that number 2 wide receiver role, I think Washington still has that big play upside. I'm not even recommending necessarily that you should draft him, but his overall season numbers should be pretty good. Now, he could be pretty inconsistent week to week. That's why I urge caution, reaching for him too much. But I've been heavily investing in sort of this Antonio Brown target void. So, I've been loading up on James Washington, Dante Moncrief, and especially Vance McDonald. I'm just trying to cash in on that upside from Brown being gone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's the thing. They've been talking him up so much. And it just reminds me of like the Devontae Adams. I remember Devontae Adams, his rookie season, everybody was like off of him. They were selling him in Dynasty. They were moving off. And all we kept hearing is Aaron Rodgers saying the kid's going to be a star. Just give it time. And nobody really wanted to do that. And we've seen his efficiency grow every single year. I've heard them talk the same way about James Washington. Like it seems like Roethlisberger loves him. Tomlin loves him. It's just a matter of getting that, the work that he's doing on the practice field to the game field. And I don't think Dante Moncrief, a guy who's on his 3rd team in 3 years, is going to break out. Let's just be real. Let's move on from that, shall we? I'm not saying that Ben Roethlisberger can't pad his stats a little bit, but let's not forget he played with Andrew Luck. Luck was a top 3 quarterback that whole time. So I love the call on James Washington. I think the risk is worth the reward there. Another receiver, this is one where we definitely differ. And we've had a few experts on the show who talk about this guy, and I can't get behind it, but if there's one person that can probably convince me, it's you. Tyrell Williams, you have as 9 spots higher than the consensus. Why is Tyrell Williams being undervalued by ECR and even more so me?
Yeah, this is another thing where I think it's just kind of where my projections just kind of end up. He's not really a guy I'm getting a lot of, but I think, he should be the number 2 option in this offense. And all the fanfare and attention's on Antonio Brown, rightfully so. But, Tyrell Williams could have some sneaky weeks. And we've seen in the past, Carr does spread the ball around. So, back when they had Amari Cooper and even Michael Crabtree, he still made Seth Roberts annoyingly fantasy relevant. So I think Carr, Antonio Brown could get double teamed and draw a lot of attention, and Carr could look Tyrell's way. They don't have Jared Cook anymore, so I just think Tyrell Williams upsides there. And again, his overall numbers I think are going to be, his ECR right now is 55. I think his overall numbers will be in the top 50, but I just don't know if he's going to be consistent enough for me to target him in this range. So this is just a case where my projections sort of outrank the ECR, but it's not necessarily indicating I'm drafting him in a ton of leagues.
And this is perfect. This is perfect because I don't have to change my stance on him. We had Jared Smolla on the show, and he was talking about Tyrell Williams being one of the most undervalued assets in fantasy, and I'm like, I can't get behind it. I do believe that he's going to finish as a top 55 wide receiver like at the end of the year as long as he's healthy. I do believe that, but I don't want to draft him. Like, there's going to be a lot of inconsistency there. I don't believe in Derek Carr as a consistent option. I'm worried enough about Antonio Brown. Like, not Tyrell Williams going from Phillip Rivers to Derek Carr is a massive downgrade, and I just don't think people understand that. I actually agree with your process on this one. That's why I asked you the question, because I know you're the projections guru, and that's why you're so accurate in season, is because like you're a realist when it comes to all that stuff. And it's like, these are the projections. This is the most likely of scenarios, and it's going to work out like more often than not. But me, when I do my rankings, I start with projections and then I mess with it from there. Like if I go into a draft or a mock draft and I get to a player that's next on my rankings there and I'm like, whoa, I would not draft this guy over this guy. I need to move that guy down. And I continually do that. And I know it hurts me in the season long, competition. But at the same time, I'm going to have my rankings like reflect what I would tell someone to do. And Tyrell Williams to me is like a waiver wire guy where it's like you could pick him up if you know the Raiders are going to be in a shootout and you're looking for that one of those boom games. You know what I mean? But yeah, I think our process is the same. It's just a matter of projections versus where you actually take a player, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned the season long rankings are one thing. I think there's just so many factors that go into this that are outside of our control. We mentioned missed games, or we overlooked a guy or a situation or a teammate gets hurt. There's just so many factors that we can't predict. So the season long contest is a little bit trickier for me. But weekly, it's such a straightforward competition, and I'm actually, for the weekly contest, I'm projecting percent chance or odds exactly where guys are going to finish. So even if a guy I have ranked 8th, he could actually be more likely to finish higher than that, or vice versa. So when it comes to weekly rankings, I'm going even further than that, and really trying to analyze the skill set of the player, the stats he relies on. And I think that's why I do so well in the weekly is I'm projecting like what buckets or what range guys are more likely to go, with the results for the week. For sure.
And you've done an excellent job at that. There's no one better than you, seriously, in that category. So yeah, hats off to you, man. All right, so let's talk about some players you're lower on. One that pops off the page is a Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver that, a lot of people didn't really want to draft while he was in Buffalo. But, Sammy Watkins went on the field last year. I think he was worth more than the 40th wide receiver, which is where you have him in your rankings. But does this have to do with like the projections and expecting Watkins, that foot injury to flare up and him to miss more time?
I mean, a lot of this has to do with the Tyreek news. I actually had Watkins ranked wide receiver 25th for the longest time. I have way too much exposure in best ball, so I'm trying to back out of that a bit. But this is just, it could be experts not have updated the Tyreek news, so a reminder to experts to update that. So I'm not sure how much of it's due to that, but yeah, with Tyreek back in the mix, Watkins should be the number 2 receiver, but, Kelsey and even someone like Damian Williams could, out-target Watkins. So he's essentially the number 4 option, I think, in this offense, which is still valuable on the Chiefs. But I think people might overrate him just because he's the number 2 receiver when you have, running back and tight end that they're going to have a bigger target share, in my opinion. But yeah, I think he should stay healthy this year. He's still relatively young. So I do like him. Just it's going to require someone to miss time, I feel.
Yeah, I feel like he's like one of those guys that you can live with as a boomer bust wide receiver 3 if you have some consistency up top. Like if you have a solid number 1 and number 2 option that they're going to be relatively consistent. Wide receiver 2 or better numbers. 50 to 75% of the time. Watkins, you can live with a little bit of the ups and downs because we do obviously expect regression for Patrick Mahomes in a sense, and that's going to eat into everybody's production, not just Tyreek Hill's. The other player you're lower on is actually tied to another elite quarterback, and that's Devin Funchess. You have him 9 spots lower than the expert consensus does. Is this like you concerned about Paris Campbell, or you just don't think that Devin Funchess is going to be much of a red zone option? I said on a podcast a couple weeks ago, I wouldn't be shocked at the end of this year if we were like, Devin Funchess was the Eric Ebron of 2019. That if he led this team in touchdowns, would I be shocked? No, I really wouldn't.
Yeah, that's a great point. It kind of goes back to what we were saying. I wanted to point this out because my projections for him are a little bit lower. I think he does have a low floor. You mentioned Paris Campbell, but there's just so many other options on that team. So I think he could become a little bit touchdown dependent, which is going to lower his floor. So his upside is immense. Like you said, if he does inherit, Luck's number 2 option, especially if they line him in the slot more. He was a tight end back in college, so he's done a lot better in the slot. But that means he's going to have to compete with Ebron and Doyle even more. There's just so many moving parts that in my projections it suppresses him a bit. But I do target him in best ball formats where you're willing to kind of take that upside. So he's a guy where his median projections are going to be lower due to my model, but any kind of upper movement or players missing time or gaining rapport with Luck, which is something that we'll pay attention to in preseason. I'm going to be diligently updating my projections over the next month, so you could see some big changes there. But just the snapshot right now, he just does have a lower floor if he becomes too much touchdown dependent, and we can't bank on a ton of targets or yards.
This is why I love having Sean on, because he's the projection guy, and he explains things in a way that makes you understand why rankings might be a little bit different than projections, and the potential that you get with someone like Devin Funchess, and the floor you get as well. So understanding both of those is phenomenal. Moving over to the quarterback position, we've talked about Jameis Winston on the show. I think every show we probably bring him up at some point, just because he's a tremendous value. I said the other day that people need to learn how to do math, because if you have Chris Godwin as a top 20 receiver, you have Mike Evans as a top 10 receiver, OJ Howard as a top 5 tight end. Like, all these things add up to where it's like, who's throwing them the damn ball? And I literally so this is going to tie in both of your players. So the player you're higher on is Jameis Winston, and the player that you're lower on is Drew Brees. Someone was in my mentions the other day telling me I was a moron because I had Jameis Winston ranked ahead of Drew Brees. This is where people need to separate fantasy from reality. And the reality is that Drew Brees has had declining pass attempts, that defense has gotten better, and they're just moving towards closer to 500 pass attempts than they are 650 like they used to. Whereas Jameis Winston, the defense in Tampa, whew, that's bad. That's bad. It's going to lead to a whole lot of pass attempts under Bruce Arians. Can you explain to everyone why you would take someone like Jameis Winston over Drew Brees?
Well, okay, first off, I'm going to vouch for you're not a moron. I agree with you 100%. When it comes to real life and their careers, sure, Drew Brees is better than Jameis Winston, but we are talking about 2019 fantasy football, so that's what we care about. And, Jameis Winston, I feel like I've been high on him for 3 years now. Last year I got burned. We got caught starting him and then being benched for Ryan Fitzpatrick, and then Ryan Fitzpatrick starting, and then Jameis Winston coming and having a huge game. So I'm hoping that with Ryan Fitzpatrick gone and Bruce Arians in town, he'll at least give us that stability where we know Winston's the guy. He's going to play the entire game, and that's all I need. He has that passing upside. They combined for the number 2 QB in fantasy last year, but he started to flash his rushing upside last year too. I think he does have some, room to grow in the running game, especially, the touchdown department. He's only had 1 the past 3 years. I think he has 4 to 5 rushing touchdown upside. So I just think he's the guy that he has that rare blend of passing and rushing upside that's like QB1 overall status, and he comes at a discount. So you could typically draft him as the 12th or 13th QB off the board, and that's kind of the sweet spot where my draft plan works out, where that's when I'm already loaded up on running back, wide receiver, and tight end, that I can start to address my quarterback needs, and you get a potential QB1 overall guy. So I'm all about Jameis Winston. And then when it comes to Drew Brees, he seems like a high floor, safe type of guy, but last year we saw his really low floor. He had 7 games where he threw less than 220 yards, really pulled the bottom out of your fantasy team. He probably lost you some of those games because of it. So I don't like Brees if he turns into this high ceiling, low floor kind of quarterback. And we saw Taysom Hill annoyingly take over some red zone packages. So I'm when it comes to my weekly projections, I'm factoring that in. That eats into his, touchdown pie. And we saw last year 4 rushing touchdowns from him, career high. I doubt he's going to match that. So there's just too much downside to him. Like you said, that their defense is solid, their running game's solid, so they just don't need to rely on him throwing a ton. So if the game script sets up for it, he's just gonna hand it off and become more of a game manager. So I don't want to be drafting that over a guy like Winston.
Yeah, and count me as someone that believes that Jameis Winston learned a very valuable lesson in 2018. He's always been that gunslinger of a quarterback, and you saw that, in the first 4 games that he actually played in 2018, he threw 10 interceptions in 4 games. Okay, he was benched. And he was brought back for the final 7 games. Okay, the final 7 games, he threw multiple touchdowns in 5 of them. He only threw 4 interceptions in those 7 games. I think Jameis Winston learned. I think that he understood that he needed to dial it back a little bit in order to grow. And, maybe an offseason, and Bruce Arians should definitely help. I mean, we saw Arians turn, Carson Palmer into someone that was startable in fantasy at times. So yeah, I definitely dig both of these calls. We don't need to talk about Jameis Winston anymore. Obviously everyone that comes on the show loves him, which tells you the public is just way too low, as the quarterback's 16 right now in ADP. Tight ends, this one's really rough because once you get outside the top, 6, 7 tight ends, you're basically streaming the position. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but the players that you're higher and lower on, you have Jimmy Graham 5 spots higher than the ECR. You have Jared Cook 4 spots lower. I actually think I might have Jimmy Graham a little bit higher. So I'm definitely with you there. And I definitely have Jared Cook a little bit lower. First year with Drew Brees, first year in that system. People are still stuck on the fact that Drew Brees, makes fantasy tight ends. No, Jimmy Graham was really freaking good at football, so he got a lot of targets. Jared Cook, we've seen him play with Aaron Rodgers. I just don't know if there's the target share for him to get involved, because then you're going to have to start taking away from Alvin Kamara, and you don't want to do that. What's the reason you have Jimmy Graham 5 spots higher than the ECR?
So that's definitely due to just overall projections. I mean, we saw he stunk last year and he still finished tight end 14 with 2 touchdowns. And Aaron Rodgers stunk last year and only threw 25 touchdowns. So, I'm projecting Rodgers to throw just north of 30 touchdowns. So, the rising tide rises all boats kind of thing. I think Jimmy Graham should see a spike in touchdowns. So if he stays healthy, I think that it's a no-brainer. He could finish top 12. Tight end, it really doesn't take too much production to crack the top 12. Jay Sternberger is a guy I'll, pay attention to in preseason, but I don't think he's going to really have a role year one. I think they're grooming him to kind of take over maybe next year when Jimmy Graham's potentially gone. So, I like Jimmy Graham's upside for, to start off just taking him. And then if he doesn't pan out, you can stream the position the rest of the season. So, he's a guy I'm not too high on, but he does have that touchdown upside that, when you're drafting a tight end, you can't really be too picky. So you want to get a guy that can at least get in the end zone.
Yep. That's basically where I'm at with it. And it's I think it's so funny that we say Aaron Rodgers stunk last year. And it's true. To his standards, he stunk. 25 touchdowns and 2 interceptions is that's so funny. That's why Aaron Rodgers, I think, is one of the more undervalued quarterbacks this year in fantasy football. He played through some injuries last year, but I'm with you here. I think that Graham, I think it's rare to find a tight end outside the top 10 that can score double-digit touchdowns. While Jimmy Graham may be on the downside of his career and he's not going to put up the yardage he used to, I still think that he's capable of scoring 10 touchdowns, especially now that, he's had a full year to build rapport with Aaron Rodgers. That definitely helps. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's not many players outside, that top 10 that you can say that about. So yeah, that's going to wrap up the ECR versus our expert segment. Before we move on to the sneaky upside players, I have something to tell you. Fantasy football fans, listen up. Do you want to join the biggest NFL season-long tournament ever? Of course you do. If you love fantasy football, and we know you do, then you need to enter the $3.5 million Best Ball Championship on Draft. That's right, $3.5 million in real money. It's huge. Here's how Best Ball works. It's season long with no management. Just set it and forget it. Once you're done drafting, that's it. No trades, no waiver wire to worry about. You don't even have to set your lineup. Your best players automatically get started, and you'll get the best score every week, guaranteed. No salary caps. Play in a real live snake draft, just like you play with your friends in season-long leagues. There's no better place to play, and you can draft a team anytime you want. Leagues start every couple minutes, so you can join one right now. Just do a draft, and you could be a millionaire 16 weeks later. It doesn't get any easier than that. Join me on Draft today. Download the app anytime. Just search Draft in the app or Play Store and join a game in minutes, or play right from your computer on draft.com, whatever you want. Right now, all new players get a free entry into a best ball draft when you make your first deposit. But you have to use the promo code FantasyPros, all one word. That's right, play a real money game for free just by using promo code FantasyPros on your first deposit on Draft. Just search Draft in the App Store or go to draft.com and come play free with promo code FantasyPros. All right, Sean. So we're going to talk about some sneaky upside players, and this can be defined in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to pass this torch to you, and I'm going to have you explain what it meant to you, and then we're going to talk about the players that you feel have that sneaky upside potential.
So for me, sneaky upside, I try to define it as guys that I think, obviously they have the upside to crush their ADP, but also become consistent fantasy starters, so consistently outperform their ADP. So I'm not necessarily going to target, extreme hot, cold, high risk, high reward guys like Josh Allen. I kind of emphasize this, but so many people I feel like have, sort of the best ball or daily fantasy big tournament. You have to look for high ceiling, kind of upside for your head-to-head season-long fantasy football team. I think it's the opposite. I think I want guys with a higher floor. I think as long as your fantasy team is consistently producing above average results, you're going to win more games than you lose. And that should be your only goal. So you don't have to always beat all 11 guys in your league every week. You just have to beat your opponent. So, I've run simulators and done all these things, and it's the guys with the high floor that can add value to your team. So when it comes to sneaky upside, these guys, I think, can be more consistent than what their ADP indicates.
Absolutely. And that's I love the idea of the high floor players, and some of the players I have on your list here today also present that massive ceiling. And let's start at quarterback, because that's where this list is at. That's what I want to, we just left off with Jameis Winston and Drew Brees. Mitch Trubisky. I've been saying it. People call me a homer because I like Trubisky in fantasy this year. Guys, I just want to be clear. Before Matt Nagy arrived in Chicago, I wanted nothing to do with any Bear outside of Matt Forte. Mitch Trubisky is someone that I want to own in fantasy this year. I have him ranked as my number 13 quarterback right now. I feel like he presents top 5 potential, and that's sneaky upside considering he's being drafted around the quarterback 18 to 20 range, plays for a high-scoring offense, a great head coach, offers you that rushing floor. Trubisky, how high are you on him this year?
So I'm very high on him, and, I mentioned earlier guys with the higher floor. Mitch Trubisky did not have a high floor last year. He was very much a extremely high upside and, high downside kind of QB. So I'm kind of anticipating him to be a little more consistent this year. But he's going in that QB 18 range with Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, but his sneaky upside is with his pass rush combo. Neither one of those guys really have a 300-yard game in them. We obviously know their rushing ability, but Trubisky also has the rushing ability. Last year he had 4 300-yard passing games and 5 40-yard rushing games. That is like the optimal combo in my model. So, every week he's going to have QB1 upside. And we saw it in his 3-game stretch. I think it was weeks 4 through 7 last year. We had over 300 yards, 2+ passing touchdowns, and over 40 yards rushing. That is just like break fantasy football upside. So I think that's why he's worth taking late. A guy like Josh Allen, I don't think he'll be able to maintain the crazy high rushing upside last year, but I also don't think he has the 300 game potential, and Trubisky does. So out of that group, I've been kind of using Trubisky as my high upside guy, but when it comes to consistency, I think we could see that this year. It will help if the Bears defense is a little bit less elite. So if they regress at all under Chuck Pagano taking over for Vic Fangio, it could just allow Trubisky to throw a little bit more, be part of more plays. He has a ton of weapons. This is his second year in the Matt Nagy system. Even Jordan Howard being gone could give him some more goal line opportunities. I'm not sure if Mike Davis or David Montgomery will command, goal line carries. We saw Matt Nagy get pretty creative around the goal line last year. So I think just Jordan Howard being gone can help boost Trubisky's touchdown upside. So for me, it's just, getting more of that consistent QB1 production is what I'm looking for this year.
For sure. This one I'm curious to hear about why you feel this way. Jimmy Garoppolo, he's someone that you feel has some sneaky upside, and my concern with him is he's not going to run the ball at all. So he basically needs to have those massive passing numbers. And, like someone like last year, like Phillip Rivers, for example, threw 4,300 yards, 32 touchdowns, finishes the number 13 quarterback. I feel like these dinosaurs in fantasy football, as I call them, is just like these guys have remained the exact same, and they haven't changed. They're still great at football. But it hurts in fantasy football when you have a bunch of these quarterbacks rushing for, 500 yards and a couple touchdowns. Jimmy Garoppolo isn't going to do that.
Yep, I agree 100%, and that's why I'm calling it sneaky upside, is he does not have overall QB1 upside, and this would be a scenario where we're not trying to do that. I think his upside is to be a weekly high floor, low end QB1 for cheap. So I think with him, his ADP, I think it's QB 21 or 22 right now. I think it just, it goes to show how deep the QB position is this year. So he allows you to just completely punt QB for the longest time and go for higher upside players at other positions early on. So I think that's sort of where the sneaky upside comes in, is just the way you construct your roster. So, again, getting a low end QB1 for cheap, or potential low QB1 for cheap, I think is where the upside lies with him. You're kind of punting, not swinging for the fence, getting a QB1 overall guy. You're just kind of getting solid production every week. And that's why people do overpay for guys like Brady and Rivers. They're kind of that type of quarterback, but you kind of have to use higher draft capital to lock that up when you can get that later on with Jimmy G. But, I think his first full season in the Kyle Shanahan offense, he could surprise us. I mean, he played, 8 games total in it so far, and he put up 150 points, which if you, extrapolate that over a 16-game season, he would have been QB8 last year. So he has a ton of weapons on offense. I think in order to kind of hit his ceiling, he would definitely need to see some touchdown luck in the passing department. So there's always that, but I just think with him, he kind of helps you set up a draft plan where you could be more aggressive at other positions.
Yeah, and they've definitely, added some value around him. Like Dante Pettis wasn't playing in the beginning of the season when he was still healthy. Deebo Samuel was added. Jalen Hurd was added. Tevin Coleman's a better pass catcher than what they've had on the roster. No more Alfred Morris, which is always a positive. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons to like Garoppolo, but I think that, again, you and I agree on this, and the fact that he doesn't have like the massive ceiling, but I think he's actually a buy in dynasty leagues right now, because he's falling in those leagues where he was considered a top 10 option locked in last year, and now he's falling outside the top 15. So I like Garoppolo in dynasty there. Going to the running back position, one player that you're high on that you feel like has sneaky upside. Bobby, actually, he's not here to talk about this, but Latavius Murray, he has him ranked as like close to the RB20. Like he's basically saying that Latavius Murray is going to be like an RB2 almost every week, and if something happened to Alvin Kamara, Latavius would be a league winner.
Yep, that's pretty much how I feel about it. I don't have him as high as 20, but I get it when you're factoring the Kamara upside. I don't think we can count on a Kamara injury, but I'll get to that in a second. But so Latavius Murray, I did a whole article on all 32 teams. I went into my weekly projections model, and I just basically said, I went through every team and said the starting running back is out. How do my projections change? And then I did some metrics around, which guys got a boost up, which guys were being undervalued by ADP. But the type of running back that I just love to get every year is a Latavius Murray type. He's a mid-round running back, likely the second part of a timeshare. So the second fiddle of a running back by committee, where, they'll probably put up decent, low end RB2, possibly RB3 or flex production weekly. But they do have that RB1 upside. And last year, those guys were Derrick Henry and Tevin Coleman for me. So I had them in a lot of leagues, and they both panned out. So I think with Murray, Bobby's right. If you anticipate the full Mark Ingram role for Murray, he is a, middling RB2. I don't think he'll inherit the entire role, but still, going RB36, I think right now, he's already having some value if he's going to have, even 80% of the Ingram role. But also, I think with fantasy football, especially this time of year, we kind of forget, just how savage it is, and there's going to be a ton of injuries. So there is that chance that Kamara does miss some time, and, any week that Kamara's out, I have Murray as a slam dunk RB1 in my weekly model. So just having that sneaky upside with a player that should, he should cash in his ADP as is anyway. I think players like that, where it's just a win-win scenario, I love getting them in the mid-rounds.
Absolutely. If you can get Latavius Murray as your flex, I am more than okay with that.
Oh, yeah. I would love that.
Absolutely. Like, I think it's like the Mark Ingram role. And it's like, people talk about, well, Mark Ingram is Mark Ingram. Well, we've only ever seen Mark Ingram in the Saints offense. So let's chill on that a little bit. Whereas Latavius Murray has gone from the Raiders to the Vikings, and he's been able to make it work. It's not like, the Vikings had a great offensive line that everyone can run behind. We've seen over the years. So I like Latavius. I think that you guys are both onto something there. I won't put him as RB20, but I think I have him as like RB28. So I have him as like a high-end RB3. A couple other players. You have Tevin Coleman. We mentioned at the top of the show. You have Chris Carson. Love it. But the one that's really it's sticking out to me. Again, this is another guy that Bobby's talked about. Chase Edmunds. David Johnson. He's now 28 years old, and you have Chase Edmunds behind him on a team that they're expecting, and I'm putting this in quotes. You guys can't see my hands, but I'm putting it in quotes that they're expecting to run 70 to 75 plays per game. If they had 70, it's pretty impressive. And David Johnson can't be on the field for that much. He just can't. No player stays in the field that much. Chase Edmunds, what's the upside here?
Yeah, I think you're exactly on to what I'm getting at. But, people they understand that Chase Edmunds is clearly David Johnson's handcuff. People do realize that if David Johnson were to miss time, Edmunds would be potentially a league winner. I think he can handle that workhorse role. That offense will be exciting this year. But I think even without a David Johnson injury, he could carve out, low-end RB3 flex role. We've already seen Cliff Kingsbury say he expects a really nice role for Edmunds. I think that's mostly coach speak, but kind of what you're getting at. If their pace is as fast as they kind of want it to be, there's going to be a ton of plays, which, that could allow Edmunds to carve out a role. But also, David Johnson won't be able to be on the field the entire time. So there could be, complete drives where they just have Edmunds in there. So I think just getting, it's sort of with Latavius Murray, but Edmunds is pretty much free at RB76. It's just getting a potential league winner who might actually produce usable fantasy value in a pinch, even with starter David Johnson perfectly healthy.
Yep, that's basically how I feel about it. And it's like, looking at the stats from last year, there were just 5 running backs in all of football who played more than 64% of their team snaps. Just 5. McCaffrey, Saquon, Ezekiel Elliott, David Johnson, and Todd Gurley. That was it. Outside of that, everybody else was under 65% of the snaps.
Yikes. And yeah, just to be clear, I'm not saying that David Johnson won't have a big role. I just think there might be so many snaps to go around that David Johnson can have the workhorse role and Edmunds has enough snaps to be a pretty good complementary back.
And it's funny, we're going to go to the wide receiver position now. This goes off the Latavius thing. Calvin Ridley. Okay. Bobby and I made a bet for this season on I have Calvin Ridley. Bobby has Corey Davis. I believe Calvin Ridley is the superior option. Bobby is sticking with Corey Davis. I like Corey Davis as a talent, but I refuse. I'm done. I am done. But Calvin Ridley is the guy that has, that wide receiver 3, wide receiver 2 weekly startability. But if something were to happen to Julio, kind of like Alvin Kamara, that whole conversation, Calvin Ridley becomes like a must start every single week, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's fair to point out that the Falcons defense had a lot of bad injury luck last year. They lost 3 key players by week 3. But if you look, Julio Jones, Mohamed Sanu, Calvin Ridley, and Austin Hooper, they all played 16 games. So they were very fortunate with injury luck there. And I'm not saying anyone's going to get hurt, but any injury to any of those players is going to help them. I think maybe not Julio. I think Julio might be maxed out with his target share. But yeah, you're right. If either Julio or even Sanu or even Hooper miss any time, Ridley just has even more upside. But even if they all play 16 games again, Calvin Ridley is a year 2 breakout candidate. I mean, he already broke out last year, but he's a lot older than most rookies were, and he's only a few months younger than Amari Cooper. So he's physically able to have more of a year 2 breakout than any other player. There definitely will be some touchdown regression. I think he had like a 15 to 16% touchdown rate last year. So I'm regressing that down quite a bit. But even with his projected line of 65 catches, 840 yards, and I have him getting 7.4 touchdowns, he's still mid to low end wide receiver 2. So you just have Even his median projection, he's kind of going where he should, but he has that sneaky upside that we're both kind of hitting on.
So Sean, feel free to tell Bobby right now, so if he's listening, that he's wrong in this bet and that I'm going to win.
Yeah, well, I agree with Bobby quite a bit about everything, even, butter on pizza. I think he's right about that. But I think this one, I would say you're probably minus 200 favorite. Straight up. I think that really has a pretty good chance to outscore Corey Davis this year.
That's from the odds maker himself, sir. So whatever. I mean, if you want to concede now, you can do it. The next player on your list at wide receiver is Dante Pettis. Love it. Love it. Let's talk about Dante Pettis.
So Pettis, this is my third 49er I'm talking about, so I must, love the upside of the offense this year. But, he had a very promising rookie season. You kind of mentioned he really didn't have a 90% snap kind of role until the 4-game stretch at the end of the season. And in that stretch, he was wide receiver 3 overall. So we've already seen his upside. I obviously don't think he's going to be a top flight wide receiver 1 this year, but he's being drafted wide receiver 33, which that pretty much seems like his floor to me. I think a low end wide receiver 3 would be kind of where I'd project him most weeks, and he just has upside for more. He showed his great separation skills last year. He had Nick Mullins throwing to him during that stretch where he put up wide receiver 3 numbers. So you have to anticipate with Jimmy G, the passing game itself can only get better if that's possible. And, Kittle will still be very good and draw attention away from the defense. So I just think Pettis has some pretty high upside. Even though they do have a lot of targets, I think Pettis will be able to cement himself as Garoppolo's number 2 option.
Yeah, I have Pettis at 33. I like him as a wide receiver 3. I mean, if I got into I think he's in the tier with me for like Corey Davis. I think that's a similar tier where it's like, you have a player, I think Pettis flashed a bit at the end of last season. Granted, it's a small sample size. And even if you extend that from week 10 to week 16, in those 6 games, he was the wide receiver 20 ahead of Adam Thielen during that stretch of games. So we've seen that flash, and it wasn't with Jimmy Garoppolo. So if Garoppolo, lives up to what people, kind of thought he would be, Dante Pettis is probably being undervalued and should probably be valued up in that, that Chris Godwin type territory. So, I mean, I like him. I think that the fact that they didn't put him into the starting lineup right away, I think that actually helps Pettis' cause this year, because they may not do that with Deebo Samuel. They may make Marquise Goodwin the primary number 2 and then kind of have Trent Taylor or whatever they want to do. The running backs are going to be a little bit more involved with Tevin Coleman. He could line up in the slot. So I love the call on Pettis here. We mentioned James Washington earlier on the show. I think people know that one. But the last name you have on here is someone that someone else talked about, Pat Fitzmaurice, when he was on the show. He talked about Philip Dorsett. You have the same name in your category here. Tell us why Philip Dorsett could be undervalued right now.
Yeah, he kind of fits in that John Ross late round flyer. I do like the call when people say John Ross is a great late round flyer, especially in the wide receiver 100 range. They're basically free. Ross's upside is with the new offense under Zach Taylor, he could break out. He is, the third wide receiver on the Bengals with Andy Dalton. But, Dorsett's upside could become, the second wide receiver in the Patriots offense with Tom Brady. So I do like that upside a little bit more. There's a lot of warts on Dorsett's, projection for me right now. Much like Ross, he was a first round pick. I think it's safe to say he's been in the league long enough we can call him a bust. But he's still only 26, and he was fairly productive last year when Edelman was out. Edelman's back, of course, but the depth chart's pretty thin as is right now. So if Demaryius Thomas doesn't make the team, which I think is possible, Josh Gordon doesn't return, N'Keal Harry struggles, Dorsett could, thrust himself to be Brady's second or third option. So I think he's just a worth a flyer just to kind of take on sort of that gamble. And if it doesn't work out, you drop him. So I think just taking him as a late round bench stash is sort of worth it. Just, buying into the Pats offense super cheap, sort of getting a penny stock, I think is the way to go, because he could flash that upside at some point. I think this is the last year we can kind of, bank on it, but I just think he's sort of the John Ross type flyer I'm taking at the end of drafts.
For sure. And the last name you had mentioned there is Josh Reynolds. Obviously not someone you want starting week to week, but if there's ever an injury in that Rams starting wide receiver core, we've seen the upside with Josh Reynolds. But over in tight end, you have Austin Hooper here, which I don't know if I can see it, just because, like, as you mentioned, just a moment ago about, the Falcons having so many injuries on defense leading to more pass attempts. We had everyone healthy last year. I know Hooper finished, I think it was the tight end 6 or 5, but he was like quite a distance from the top 4. So there was quite the change there. So this one, it's like, I feel like Hooper is kind of like that boring low-end tight end 1 where it's like, yeah, he's fine, but I don't think that he's going to win anybody any leagues.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think with Hooper, it's sort of that sneaky back end of the draft ADP upside. He's definitely not the sexy pick. That's why you can get him super late. I think he's going outside the top 120 overall. I just think, especially outside of the top 3, we have that mini elite tight end 1 tier with OJ Howard, Evan Ingram, Hunter Henry. I wouldn't consider Ebron part of that, but I think that Hooper definitely has potential to be, part of that tier, if not the best one. You mentioned, last year he was sort of underwhelming and he was still tight end 6. I think a lot of that has to do with just, like we mentioned, he played the entire season. I think people overlook just playing the entire season is going to sort of boost their end of season rank. But I think, with him, there's a couple things I'm looking at. His touchdown percentage for his career is pretty low. It's been 7%, which is kind of fishy, given his skill set, the passing offense he's on. So I am projecting a little bit of boost there. So I think if he can just regress to, an average rate of 8.5 to 9 for a tight end, he could be overlooked. And, when it comes to Dirk Cutter, take this with a grain of salt, but I went back and I sort of looked at tight ends in his system. He had Mercedes Lewis in Jacksonville, who averaged about 2 more fantasy points a game under Cutter in his 5 seasons as opposed to his other 8 seasons. Granted, that was sort of in his prime. So that's why I'm, not looking at too much. But we had Tony Gonzalez, his historical Hall of Fame 17-year career. He actually had his highest average in the last 2 seasons when he was 36 and 37 under Cutter. He averaged 11.3 fantasy points versus his career average of 10.4. And then we saw Cameron Brate and OJ Howard in Tampa Bay that only played under Cutter. So I think there could be some potential with Cutter, just, the way he schemes tight ends that might give Hooper sort of that red zone upside that I think. I think with him, just if his touchdown rate can spike up, I think that's sort of where I'm seeing his upside or his sneaky upside.
For sure. Well, the last player we'll talk about today is a guy that Bobby said if there's ever a situation where you're going to handcuff a tight end, it's this one. He said Dallas Goedert is fine to draft if you draft Zach Ertz. If you want to take Goedert with your last pick, because he says if Zach Ertz were to go down with an injury, Goedert is like legitimately a high-end tight end 1 every single week, and it's hard to disagree with that.
Absolutely. And, earlier I was talking about how, the first 3 rounds I'm conservative. I don't take chances. I'm just trying not to lose. Even, my week-to-week lineup, I try to play it safe. When it comes to my bench, I do take a ton of risk. So even if I don't have Ertz, if it's warranted, the bench is big enough, I'm willing to just stash Dallas Goedert. I think that there's potential that the Eagles could run more 2 tight end sets, and he could actually have some week-to-week fantasy value even if Ertz is healthy. Like we mentioned earlier, it doesn't take much to be a fantasy relevant tight end. So even if he has week-to-week touchdown upside, I think he's worth just owning. And then the league winning potential is with any time that Zach Ertz misses. I have him being a top 6 tight end in my model. So when you stash players, I like to stash guys with league-winning upside. And he does have the potential to sort of be a weekly emergency fill-in. Now, I'm not recommending wasting a bench slot on a tight end, but if I were to do it with anybody, it'd be Goedert.
There you go. And that's going to wrap up today's show. Sean, it was a whole lot of fun picking your brain and kind of, trying to give the other side of the view and saying okay, what about this? And I like going back and forth. You're one of my favorite people in the industry to talk to. You're so level-headed and you spend so much time doing this. Let the listeners know, what you're working on, where they can find your work.
You can follow me on Twitter at _oddsmaker. You can find all my work at actionnetwork.com. We just put up our draft kit. You're going to be able to have access to all my rankings, even my entire projections for every player, every team. So go check it out. And, I post articles all the time. Like I mentioned, I just did that running back piece where I go in and I simulate every starting running back out and kind of evaluating running back handcuffs, things like that. I really like to dig in deep. And yeah, thanks for having me on. I love listening to your guys' podcast. You guys are killing it. So happy to be on.
We appreciate it, Sean, and good luck during the season. I know we're all going to need it by the time December rolls around. As Sean mentioned, you can find him on Twitter at @the_oddsmaker and myself at Mike Taglier NFL. Thank you guys for tuning in, and don't forget to go and check out Draft with the free entry code FantasyPros, as well as Pristine Auction with the $5 credit for using the code FantasyPros during registration. We'll be back next week with 3 more episodes, and then the fun really begins because we're going to be moving to 5 shows per week the week of August 5th.